Clemencia Torrealba was not born among the silks and perfumes of the noble courts of New Spain. She entered the world in a mud-walled hut on the outskirts of Puebla, sometime in the mid-1600s. Her family was one of countless poor mestizo households, descendants of Spaniards and indigenous people, who lived in the shadow of a colonial system designed to keep them pressed down. Her father was a field worker who died before she could remember his face, and her mother washed clothes for wealthy families in exchange for coins barely enough to keep them alive. For young Clemencia, childhood was hunger. She grew up watching the children of landowners and merchants walk by in fine shoes while her own feet blistered on the cobblestones. She listened to her mother's quiet weeping when there was no food to serve and learned, early on, that survival often meant bending rules or looking the other way. This constant deprivation planted in her heart a dangerous seed, not just the desire to survive, but the fierce determination never again to be at the mercy of another person's wealth or pity. What separated Clemencia from countless others in her situation was not simply her hunger but her mind. She was quick, observant, and able to notice details others missed. When her mother worked in the kitchens of the wealthy, young Clemencia tagged along, pretending to help scrub pots. But her real focus was elsewhere. She watched the nobles, studied how they behaved, listened to their complaints and desires, and most importantly, learned the unspoken truth. Power was not just about gold, it was about access. By the time she reached her teenage years, Clemencia had already begun working her way into circles far above her birth. She learned to flatter, to mimic the speech of noblewomen, to dress with small touches of elegance, even if her clothing was made of patched cloth. More importantly, she discovered the art of service as a mask for ambition. Wealthy women saw her as a clever servant, a girl who could be trusted to fetch wine, deliver notes, or carry secrets. She smiled, curtsied, and lowered her gaze, but all the while, she was studying their weaknesses. It was during these years that Clemencia first encountered the knowledge that would define her life, the uses of herbs, powders, and poisons. From indigenous healers, she learned which plants soothed and which sickened. From apothecaries, she memorized the properties of imported chemicals sold under the guise of medicine. In kitchens, she saw how spices could mask bitterness, how wines could hide the sting of powders that killed slowly. To most, this knowledge was fragmented, harmless, and scattered. To Clemencia, it was the foundation of power. Her entry into noble households was not accidental. Word spread of her skill in preparing remedies and broths for the ill. When a wealthy woman's child suffered fevers, Clemencia appeared with herbs that calmed him. When an old merchant groaned with pain, she brewed a tea that gave him sleep. She became known as a girl who brought results, and slowly, she earned invitations into the inner chambers of the rich. By her early 20s, Clemencia was no longer a servant who scrubbed floors. She was seated at the edges of noble tables, serving dishes she had prepared herself, trusted to mix remedies, and whispered about as the clever one who knows secrets. But beneath her obedient smiles, Clemencia never forgot the poverty she had crawled from. Every sip of wine she poured for a nobleman, every delicacy she served to a lady draped in jewels, reminded her of nights when she and her mother had starved. To her, the nobles were not masters to be served, but prey to be studied. She noticed their arrogance, their carelessness, their assumption that someone of her birth could never touch them. It was precisely this blindness that would become their downfall. The transformation from poverty to proximity of nobility was not simple luck. It was calculated patience. Clemencia learned to wear invisibility like a cloak. She was there when secrets were whispered over banquets, when jealous wives accused one another of betrayal, when men discussed inheritances and disputes over land. She learned that noble households were not united fortresses, but fragile webs of envy, fear, and ambition. And within those cracks, she saw opportunity. For Clemencia, reaching the tables of nobility was not the end of her journey. It was the beginning. She had climbed from mud floors to polished halls, not by accident, but by design. And unlike those who were born into privilege, she understood hunger, resentment, and the fury of being denied dignity. That understanding became her weapon. Her story during this period reveals a chilling truth about human ambition. Poverty may birth resilience, but without virtue it can also breed vengeance. Clemencia was a product of her time and place, but she also made choices. Where another might have used access to nobility to lift themselves honestly, Clemencia allowed bitterness to fester until it hardened into cruelty. By the time she was fully accepted in noble households, Clemencia was no longer the poor girl from Puebla. She was a woman with knowledge, with access, and with a heart sharpened by years of resentment. To the nobles, she was a servant with rare skills. To herself, she was a hunter who had finally found her hunting ground. This is how she crossed the line from poverty to the tables of nobility, not as a guest, but as a predator waiting for the moment to strike. Every dark tale has a beginning, and for Clemencia Torrealba, the moment that turned whispers into legend began with a single, deliberate act. She had spent years preparing for this step, years of learning, blending in, and feeding her resentment against the privileged who feasted while the poor starved. But until the moment she slipped poison into a cup, her ambition had remained theory, a dangerous possibility she had not yet dared to test. The choice of her first victim was not random. Clemencia was shrewd enough to know that the first strike had to be both personal and strategic. It had to be someone who represented everything she despised, someone whose death would not only bring her satisfaction, but also test her skill without raising immediate suspicion. That opportunity presented itself in the home of Don Esteban de Almaraz, a wealthy merchant whose household Clemencia had served in from time to time. Don Esteban was known for his arrogance, for the way he treated those beneath him with disdain. He often mocked servants in front of guests, believing humiliation was a form of entertainment. Clemencia had endured his insults, his crude jokes about her mestizo blood, his threats to throw her mother out of work if she ever failed to serve properly. Each insult had been stored away in her memory like dry wood waiting for a spark. That spark came one evening when Don Esteban, already drunk from too much wine, struck a servant boy for dropping a tray. The boy crumpled to the floor, sobbing, while the nobleman laughed and demanded another cup. Clemencia, standing silently in the corner, clenched her fists until her nails dug into her palms. At that moment, the decision crystallized. This man would be her first. The poison she chose was subtle, a powder she had ground carefully days before from a mixture of imported arsenic and local herbs. It was colorless once dissolved, its bitterness masked easily by the sweetness of wine. Clemencia had practiced with smaller doses on animals, stray dogs and birds, observing how long it took before their bodies weakened. Now, her experiment was ready for human flesh. That night, when Don Esteban demanded another cup of wine, Clemencia stepped forward with her usual humility. She bowed slightly, poured the rich red liquid, and with the flick of her hand stirred in the fatal powder. Her heart pounded, but her face betrayed nothing. To anyone watching, she was simply the obedient servant fulfilling her duty. Don Esteban raised the cup, smirked at her as if she were invisible, and drank deeply. Clemencia lowered her gaze, hiding the storm inside her. Minutes passed, the room filled with conversation and laughter. Don Esteban continued to boast, his voice loud and commanding. Then slowly the change began. At first he complained of heat tugging at his collar. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. He reached for another drink, but his hand trembled, spilling wine onto the tablecloth. Laughter broke out among the guests, thinking his drunkenness had overtaken him, but Clemencia knew better. She watched as his skin paled as he clutched his stomach, groaning in sudden pain. Panic rippled through the room as Don Esteban collapsed, gasping for breath. The household erupted into chaos. Servants rushed to his side, nobles shouted for remedies, and wives screamed prayers into the air. Clemencia, blending into the commotion, knelt beside him, feigning concern. She even suggested one of her herbal remedies, furthering the illusion that she was as shocked as everyone else. Within the hour, Don Esteban was dead. The official explanation was simple: sudden illness, perhaps the result of too much food and wine. Such deaths were not uncommon in an age when medicine was limited, and disease struck often without warning. No one suspected poison. No one looked twice at the quiet servant girl who had poured his last drink. Clementia's secret was safe, but inside her, something had changed forever. Watching Don Esteban's body carried out, Clemencia felt no guilt, only exhilaration. For the first time, she had proven to herself that she held power greater than gold, titles, or armies. She could end a man's life silently, without sword or confrontation, without consequence. Her poverty, her powerlessness, her humiliation, all of it had been avenged with a single cup. This first act was more than revenge. It was initiation. Clemencia had stepped fully into the role she had crafted for herself. No longer the hungry servant girl, no longer the outsider at noble tables, but a shadow seated among them, unseen yet deadly. She realized that her victims would never recognize her as a threat, because to them she was nothing. And in that nothingness, she had discovered her greatest weapon. The first poison lit a fire inside her that could not be extinguished. What began as personal justice quickly became something darker. Clemencia discovered that each death gave her not only satisfaction, but also leverage. Fear crept quietly through households after Don Esteban's demise, though no one could name its source. Servants whispered that God had punished him for his cruelty. Nobles grew cautious, unsettled by the thought that wealth and status could not shield them from sudden death. And in the middle of it all, Clemencia smiled quietly, already planning her next move. This is how terror begins, not with a storm but with a whisper, not with open violence but with a single, silent poison dropped into a cup. Clemencia's first act was not just the death of one arrogant nobleman. It was the birth of a reign of fear, the moment she realized that the tables of nobility, once symbols of her humiliation, had now become her hunting ground. After Don Esteban's sudden death, Clemencia Torrealba had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. What had begun as a calculated act of revenge now became the seed of a new identity, one that would slowly grow into legend and terror. The first poison had given her confidence, but more importantly, it had taught her the truth: the wealthy were not untouchable. The men and women who mocked her, who dismissed her, who lived as if the world belonged to them, were no more invincible than the beggars in the streets. They bled, they weakened, they died. And with the right mixture in a chalice or bowl, she alone could determine the hour of their end. But power is never satisfied with one victory. Clemencia found herself hungry for more, not simply for blood, but for the intoxication that came with control. She began to weave poison into her very identity, reshaping herself from an overlooked servant into something far more dangerous, the silent hand of judgment against New Spain's nobility. Clemencia's first success emboldened her to experiment further. She expanded her knowledge of toxins, using the bustling markets of Mexico City as her laboratory. In the stalls where healers and herbalists sold powders, roots, and elixirs, she became a familiar face. To the vendors, she was a poor mestiza woman buying remedies for her ailing mother. To herself, she was assembling an arsenal. She studied not only the foreign poisons, arsenic from Europe, mercury disguised as medicine, but also the knowledge of the indigenous peoples. From Nahua healers, she learned of herbs that caused paralysis, seeds that brought hallucinations, and flowers that could silence a heartbeat within hours. These mixtures gave her flexibility. Not every victim needed to die suddenly. Sometimes suffering was the point. Sometimes suspicion had to be delayed. Her collection grew hidden in small jars, powders wrapped in cloth, tinctures sealed in glass vials. Each one represented a choice, a method, a different mask of death. With every preparation, she grew more confident. Clemencia understood that to rise as a poisoner, she needed invisibility. Servants were often overlooked, treated as furniture rather than people, and she exploited this to perfection. When nobles dined, she stood silently, attentive but never intrusive. She was courteous but forgettable, blending into the background so seamlessly that most guests could not recall her face hours after leaving the table. This invisibility was her cloak, her armor. It allowed her to move freely, to place herself near the most powerful men and women of the colony without arousing suspicion. Each smirk from a noble, each careless insult, each dismissal only strengthened her resolve. They would never see her coming because they did not believe she existed in the realm of power at all. But behind that mask of humility, Clemencia began to cultivate another persona, whispered among servants, hinted at in fearful gossip. Some claimed she carried a touch of the supernatural. After all, hadn't Don Esteban collapsed after mocking a servant? Didn't she always seem to know remedies, herbs, and cures that others had never heard of? Slowly, rumors began to swirl that Clemencia had connections to forces beyond the natural world. She did not deny them. Fear, after all, was as useful a tool as poison. Her second victim was no accident. It was a noblewoman, Dona Acebal, the wife of a colonial magistrate. Unlike Don Esteban, who was openly cruel, Dona Acebal was subtle in her malice. She prided herself on charity while privately humiliating her mestizo servants, refusing them food scraps and spreading gossip that ruined their chances of work. To Clemencia, she represented hypocrisy, piety in public, cruelty in private. This time Clemencia's approach was slower. She administered poison gradually through the woman's sweetened teas. Day by day, Dona Acebal weakened, her skin yellowed, her hands shook. Physicians were called, prayers were recited, but no remedy worked. By the time death claimed her, the household had already resigned itself to God's will. Once again, Clemencia walked away untouched, her face veiled with the innocence of a devoted servant. 2 deaths could still be coincidence. But Clemencia was patient. She spread her actions across different households, never too close together, never too obvious. Wealthy men and women began falling ill, some swiftly, others slowly. A merchant, a landowner, a wealthy widow. Each demise carried whispers of divine punishment, bad luck, or hidden sins, and yet servants knew. They spoke in hushed tones of the quiet woman with sharp eyes and knowledge of herbs. The gossip spread in kitchens, in courtyards, in the markets. Beware the woman who carries death in her hands. Ironically, the more deaths surrounded her, the more Clemencia was sought after. Her supposed knowledge of medicine and herbs made her valuable in times of sickness. Families hired her for remedies, asking her to prepare teas, salves, and poultices. She became both the cure and the curse, the hand that could heal or destroy. This dual identity shielded her. After all, how could the woman who nursed the sick also be the cause of death? To accuse her was to invite ridicule. Nobles, too proud to admit vulnerability, clung to their illusions of control. Servants, too fearful, kept their suspicions to themselves. Clemencia Torrealba was no longer merely a poor servant girl. She was becoming something larger, something that the colony itself would whisper about. The rise of the poisoner was not marked by open rebellion or bloodied swords, but by silence, secrecy, and inevitability. Death followed her not like a thunderstorm, but like a creeping shadow, settling quietly in noble households until the victims collapsed. What set her apart was not just her skill, but her philosophy. Clemencia did not see herself as a murderer. In her mind, she was balancing the scales. Every arrogant laugh, every slap, every insult hurled at the poor was repaid in kind. She convinced herself she was an instrument of justice, chosen not by kings or priests, but by fate itself. And with each passing year, her legend grew. She was no longer just a servant. She was the silent predator of New Spain's nobility, the woman whose hands held invisible power, the poisoner who rose from the shadows and became terror itself. By the early years of the 1700s, whispers of Clemencia Torrealba's deadly talents had spread across the elite circles of New Spain like wildfire. Though few dared to mention her name openly, everyone knew there was a shadow cast over the mansions of the wealthy. Clemencia had risen from being a humble servant to a woman whose mere presence inspired dread, not because of visible power or wealth, but because she held a weapon few could counter, her mastery of poison. Nobles who had once laughed at the idea of servants being dangerous began to check their goblets twice before drinking. Their wives tasted the wine before they did. Food tasters became common in households where suspicion lingered. Yet, despite these precautions, the sudden deaths continued. Illnesses that baffled physicians struck the most influential families: violent stomach pains, paralysis, sudden fevers that ended in silence within hours. Behind closed doors, the nobility asked themselves the same chilling question: who will be next? What made Clemencia's reign of fear even more disturbing was its invisibility. She did not brandish knives in the streets or lead gangs of thieves. She wove terror quietly, silently, leaving no trace. Her weapons were powders slipped into soups, tinctures dripped into wines, herbs that imitated natural diseases. It was said she could make death look like cholera, dysentery, or even a simple infection. This made her crimes almost impossible to prove. Those who hired her, wealthy nobles hungry for land, widows eager to inherit, rivals desperate to rid themselves of competition, kept her secret well guarded. Clemencia did not just poison. She offered her clients a path to power without ever lifting a blade. With every job, her influence spread, and so did the atmosphere of paranoia. Soon, entire families stopped dining together for fear of betrayal within their own walls. Servants were dismissed and replaced frequently, as masters feared that loyalty could not be trusted. Neighbors, once bound by ties of blood and marriage, looked at one another with suspicion. Death was no longer seen as an act of God, but as a calculated hand hidden somewhere close. But Clemencia herself was not immune to the weight of what she had unleashed. Though her face remained calm, inside her soul, shadows grew. Her own community began to avoid her. At markets, women lowered their eyes and clutched their children's hands tightly when she passed. Men refused to greet her. Whispers followed her: Bruja, asesina, alma maldita. She was feared, yes, but she was also utterly isolated. For Clemencia, however, fear had become a currency. She fed on it, using it to reinforce her power. No noble dared to confront her directly because they knew doing so might invite their own destruction. She could kill with a sip of wine or a bite of bread. In that fragile silence, Clemencia thrived, walking the fine line between notoriety and invisibility. The reign of fear even crept into the religious institutions of New Spain. Priests spoke cautiously in their sermons about the dangers of greed, betrayal, and hidden sins, often pointing indirectly at the stories that surrounded Clemencia. In confessions, nobles whispered their guilt, revealing how they had used her services to gain what they wanted. Yet, few dared to take action, afraid that their own sins would be exposed if they moved against her. This climate of suspicion and silence gave Clemencia a kind of twisted authority. She became not just a poisoner but a symbol of corruption in society itself. Her reign of fear revealed how fragile the structures of wealth and nobility were. Beneath the polished manners and gilded estates lay envy, betrayal, and the willingness to sacrifice even family for the promise of power. Still, fear always leaves cracks. Some of her clients began to turn against her, worried that she knew too much. Clemencia, after all, kept the secrets of the most powerful men and women in New Spain. Each death tied her closer to them, and though that bond protected her for a time, it also made her dangerous. If Clemencia were ever captured, she could expose names that would ruin families' estates and reputations. Thus, her survival became a shared interest among the guilty, but also a ticking clock for those who feared she might one day speak. The reign of fear reached its peak when a series of noble deaths occurred within weeks of each other. Entire households crumbled, inheritances shifted overnight, rivals disappeared, and rumors claimed that Clemencia had orchestrated it all. The streets of Mexico City buzzed with speculation. People began to believe she was not just a poisoner, but a demon sent to punish the corrupt. Mothers told their children stories of La Mujer del Veneno, warning them to stay away from strangers who smiled too kindly. Yet underneath this terror lay a deep lesson. Clemencia's reign was not built on her strength alone, but on the weaknesses of others, their greed, their jealousy, their thirst for control. She had only supplied the means. It was their corruption that allowed her to flourish. But history shows us that fear, no matter how powerful, cannot reign forever. The cracks in Clemencia's carefully constructed shadow empire would soon widen, and whispers of rebellion against her would grow louder. For now, though during those years of silent dread, her name carried more weight than soldiers with swords, she was the unseen dagger at every noble table, the invisible storm cloud hanging over every feast, the embodiment of death disguised in courtesy. Clemencia Torrealba had turned fear into her throne, and from that throne she ruled, until the very fear she spread would one day betray her. Every reign of terror eventually meets its breaking point, and Clemencia Torrealba's empire of shadows was no exception. For years she had walked untouchable, the unseen hand guiding the deaths of New Spain's nobility. Her poisons had silenced rivals, opened doors for the greedy, and turned her name into a whispered warning. But fear, as powerful as it is, has one fatal flaw. It breeds enemies in silence, and those enemies wait for the right moment to strike. By the mid-1710s, Clemencia's activities had become impossible to ignore. Too many nobles had died under mysterious circumstances. Too many inheritances had changed hands too quickly. Physicians, though limited in their understanding of toxins, began to suspect foul play. The colonial authorities, pressured by both the church and the crown, could no longer turn a blind eye. To do nothing was to admit weakness before the people. Clemencia's fall began not with a grand betrayal, but with a small mistake. A nobleman's wife, who had long suspected her husband of consorting with the poisoner, discovered an unusual vial hidden in his study. The liquid inside carried a bitter, metallic scent unlike anything she had smelled before. She turned it over to a trusted priest, who in turn alerted the Inquisition. In a world where both science and superstition mingled, such evidence was enough to ignite a hunt. Once rumors spread that evidence of Clemencia's poisons had been found, the walls of silence began to crack. Those who had once protected her, bound by guilt and fear, now saw an opportunity to save themselves by condemning her. Wealthy patrons whispered to inquisitors, pointing trembling fingers in her direction. Servants who had long suspected her dealings confessed what they had seen: secret meetings at night, nobles slipping into her quarters, powders exchanged for bags of coins. The most damning evidence came from her own clients. Some, terrified of being implicated, revealed how Clemencia had crafted mixtures of arsenic, nightshade, and other deadly herbs. They told stories of how she instructed them to disguise the taste in wine, stew, or even communion bread. Each confession built a case stronger than the last, until the authorities had little doubt. Clemencia Torrealba was not just a rumor. She was a living, breathing weapon, and she had to be stopped. Her capture was far less dramatic than her legend suggested. Soldiers stormed her modest home in the heart of Mexico City one night, finding her surrounded not by wealth or grandeur but by small vials, powders, and dried plants. She did not resist. Perhaps she knew her time had come. Perhaps, after years of isolation and fear, she was too weary to fight. The woman who had terrorized New Spain with invisible weapons simply bowed her head and allowed herself to be taken. Her trial was unlike any the colony had seen. Courtrooms filled with nobles, priests, and commoners alike, all eager to see the woman whose name had haunted their nights. The charges were laid out one by one: dozens of murders by poison, conspiracies with the wealthy to seize power, practicing the dark arts. The prosecution painted her as both a criminal and a witch, a servant of Satan who had corrupted society from within. Clemencia, for her part, remained eerily calm. Witnesses described her as dignified, even proud, as she listened to testimony after testimony. Some claimed she laughed when nobles who once relied on her now condemned her. Others swore she looked straight into the eyes of her accusers, unblinking, as if daring them to admit their own sins. For Clemencia knew the truth: she had not acted alone. She had been the tool, but the greed of others had fueled her reign. Still, truth mattered little in the face of fear and public demand. The Inquisition declared her guilty on multiple counts. Her sentence was death, not swift, but public, a warning to all who might follow in her footsteps. Execution was not just about punishing Clemencia, it was about cleansing society of the terror she represented. On the day of her execution, the streets of Mexico City were packed. Merchants closed their stalls, children climbed onto rooftops, and nobles watched from carriages as the poisoner was led to the scaffold. Her hands were bound, her head uncovered, her face pale but resolute. Some shouted curses, others whispered prayers, but all waited to see how this chapter of fear would end. Clemencia's final words were said to be chilling. According to some accounts, she proclaimed, "Do not look at me as the monster. Look at yourselves, for I only gave you what you asked for." Whether these words are truth or legend, they echo the deeper reality of her story. She was both executioner and instrument, the mirror reflecting the corruption of those who had hired her. As the blade fell, or in some tellings as the flames rose, Clemencia Torrealba's reign ended. The crowd gasped, cheered, or crossed themselves in relief. For a time, the people believed the terror was over, yet the memory of her shadow lingered. Nobles still checked their wine. Families still whispered at night about betrayal. The ghost of Clemencia lived on in the paranoia she had sown. History remembers her not just as a murderer, but as a symbol of how fear can rule a society, and how even the most powerless can rise to control the mighty. Clemencia Torrealba fell, yes, but her fall revealed more about New Spain than her crimes ever could. It revealed a world where greed thrived, where power was fragile, and where death could hide in the sweetness of wine. Every dynasty believes itself unshakable. It weaves legends of divine favor, coats its palaces in gold, and surrounds its name with reverence. For generations, the dynasty at the heart of this story had stood tall, ruling with both splendor and shadow. Its nobles walked with pride, its banners waved high, and its influence stretched like roots beneath the soil of New Spain. But all things built on corruption and fear eventually collapse, and the dynasty that had once commanded awe would find itself crumbling from within. The cracks were subtle at first, like fine lines on an aging face. The deaths that had once secured their power began to raise suspicions. Alliances once bound by marriage and wealth frayed under the weight of whispered betrayals. Every banquet became a theater of paranoia. Every toast carried the bitter aftertaste of suspicion. Nobles glanced at their goblets with trembling hands, unsure if the next sip would be their last. The dynasty's very strength, its reliance on secret dealings and unseen poisons, had turned into the very weapon that would unravel it. Clemencia Torrealba had been their silent sword, the hidden force that protected their interests and cleared their path. But when her reign of poison collapsed under the weight of discovery, the dynasty found itself exposed. The veil of invincibility was ripped away. Suddenly, the empire of shadows seemed fragile, its power less divine and more criminal. The people who once cowered under its influence now began to speak, and every rumor spread like wildfire through the crowded streets of Mexico City. The church, which had long tolerated the dynasty's presence in exchange for loyalty and offerings, grew restless. The Inquisition, fueled by the revelation of Clemencia's deeds, demanded accountability. Whispers of witchcraft and ungodliness clung to the noble name like chains, dragging their reputation into the mud. To the people, the dynasty no longer represented stability. It represented danger, greed, and blood-stained wealth. Inside their great halls, fear became the uninvited guest at every council. Once, loyal allies questioned each other. Brothers doubted sisters. Servants overheard murmurs of betrayal in candlelit chambers. The dynasty's members, once united under a banner of strength, now turned inward, each seeking to protect their own fortune and future. Some fled into exile, carrying gold and secrets with them. Others stayed, desperate to cling to fading influence, but in doing so, they painted themselves as targets for the church's wrath. The monarchy in Spain, though distant, was not blind to the chaos. Letters carried across the sea spoke of unrest, of poisoned nobles, of scandals that tarnished the crown itself. To maintain order, the king's emissaries demanded action. A dynasty that once boasted of loyalty now found itself scrutinized, stripped of privileges, and left vulnerable to the very authorities it once manipulated. Their fall was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, painful unraveling. Estates were seized, titles revoked, and lands redistributed. Rivals, long kept at bay through fear of Clemencia's deadly vials, now rose to claim their place in society. Families who had once bowed before the dynasty now turned their backs, eager to distance themselves from scandal. The great name that had once carried weight now provoked whispers of curses, as if God himself had turned against them. The people, too, celebrated their downfall. Markets buzzed with gossip, and ballads were sung of poisoned lords and scheming nobles. For the common folk, the dynasty's collapse was more than justice. It was proof that even the mighty could fall, that no fortress of gold could protect against the hand of divine judgment. The dynasty, once feared as untouchable, became a cautionary tale. But for those who had lived under its shadow, the fall carried bitterness as well. Though the dynasty was dismantled, the scars it left remained. Families torn apart by poisonings never healed. Lands seized by betrayal left generations in poverty. The collapse of one ruling house did not erase the system of greed and ambition that birthed it. In the ashes of their power, others soon rose, eager to claim the throne of influence. The lesson was clear: dynasties fall, but corruption is a disease that finds new hosts. The final blow came when the last surviving heir, stripped of wealth and honor, was paraded before the people. No longer clad in silk, no longer surrounded by servants, the heir stood as a shadow of the grandeur that once defined the family. Some accounts claim the heir begged for mercy, others say they spat defiantly at their accusers. Whatever the truth, the dynasty's last voice was silenced, and with it, an era of fear came to its end. Yet the memory lingered. Even generations later, parents whispered warnings to their children about poisoned cups and treacherous nobles. The dynasty's name, once spoken with respect, was now uttered with dread, a reminder of how arrogance and greed can rot even the strongest of houses. Their palaces crumbled, their lands were claimed by others, but their story lived on in the folklore of the people, a ghost haunting New Spain's history. The fall of the dynasty was not just the end of a family. It was the unraveling of a myth, the myth that power once seized could be eternal. It showed that fear, while powerful, is a weapon that eventually turns on its wielder. And it proved that dynasties, no matter how golden their crowns, are as mortal as the men and women who build them. History is never just about the past. It speaks to us in echoes, reminding us that the struggles of yesterday still breathe in the challenges of today. The tale of poison, betrayal, dynasties, and downfall is not just a record of events. It is a mirror. And when we look closely, what we see reflected is not only the corruption of a bygone age, but the warnings we must carry into our own. The lesson for today is simple, but it is also profound. Unchecked ambition destroys. We live in a world that glorifies power, wealth, and influence. Success is celebrated, sometimes without asking how it was achieved. But history teaches us that when ambition runs wild, without morality, without compassion, it breeds ruin. Just as the dynasty once cloaked itself in nobility while hiding poison behind its curtains, so too do we see modern versions of such deceit. Corporations that exploit workers, leaders who manipulate nations, individuals who step on others to climb higher, all mirror the arrogance of those who believed themselves untouchable centuries ago. Another lesson lies in fear. Fear was the currency of that dynasty's reign. It silenced voices, bought loyalty, and allowed poison to replace justice. But fear is fragile. It creates obedience, but it does not create love. It commands submission, but it cannot build trust. Eventually, people always rise against it, because no one can live forever in the shadow of dread. Today, whether in politics, workplaces, or personal relationships, we must remember, those who govern through fear are never truly strong. Their foundations are brittle, waiting for the first crack to shatter everything. The story also warns us about secrecy and deception. In Clemencia Torrealba's world, secrets were weapons. They were the air that the dynasty breathed. But the truth has a strange persistence. It seeps through cracks, it whispers in corners, it finds its way into the light. Lies may win time, but they never win forever. And when truth finally emerges, it burns hotter than any poison. Today, in an age where information travels at lightning speed, this lesson is sharper than ever. Transparency is not just a virtue, it is survival. Those who think they can hide corruption or treachery in the dark should remember the dynasty's fall. Every secret eventually becomes a story told by others. The lesson is also about the illusion of permanence. Dynasties believed their names would outlive centuries, carved in stone and sung in songs. Yet within a generation, their palaces became ruins, their banners forgotten. Nothing built on cruelty lasts. Empires, companies, even reputations, all crumble when built on the suffering of others. This truth should humble us. No matter how high we rise, we are not invincible. Our legacies will not be judged by how loudly our names were spoken, but by how we treated those who walked in our shadow. But perhaps the most pressing lesson is this: power does not corrupt alone, it reveals. The dynasty's corruption was not an accident. It was the fruit of hearts already hungry for greed and dominance. Clemencia Torrealba's poison did not invent evil. It merely exposed the evil already present in those halls of gold. Today, too, power reveals. Give someone authority, and you will see their true character. If they lead with compassion, it shows their heart was kind. If they lead with cruelty, it shows the poison was already there. We must therefore be careful not only of those who hold power, but of the temptations within ourselves when power falls into our hands. This story also reminds us of accountability. For years, the dynasty avoided consequences, believing themselves above law and judgment. But when their fall came, it was absolute. History insists on this truth: justice may delay, but it does not disappear. In our time, we must demand accountability, not only from governments or corporations, but from ourselves. Every choice we make, every action we take, leaves a trail. Someday, that trail will be followed, and we will be asked to answer for it. And finally, the lesson for today is one of hope, for though the dynasty's story is drenched in poison and betrayal, it ends with liberation. People who once lived in fear tasted freedom. The shadows lifted, and even if corruption rose again in new forms, the fall of one oppressor gave courage to others. The same is true today. Darkness never has the last word. No matter how overwhelming corruption, greed, or injustice may seem, history shows us that it eventually breaks. The truth emerges, justice strikes, and the people rise. So what do we take from this tale? We take vigilance, the courage to question those in power. We take humility, the reminder that no throne is eternal. We take compassion, the knowledge that true strength is not in fear but in love. And we take responsibility, the understanding that each of us contributes to the world we live in, whether through silence or through voice. The dynasty has fallen, but its lessons rise again every time someone reaches too far, hides too much, or builds on fear instead of trust. The story whispers to us across centuries: be careful with ambition, be wary of fear, and remember that truth always wins. If we forget, history will remind us. If we ignore, history will repeat itself. The dynasty fell once. The question is, will we learn, or will we build new dynasties of poison in our own time?